Princess Elena stood at her bedroom window, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard. At 12 years old, she had learned to read the subtle signs that most people missed. Her mother, Queen Isabella, had taught her well during their secret evening lessons in the royal library. The kingdom of Valdemora had been peaceful for decades, but recent whispers in the corridors spoke of growing unrest. Elena's father, King Marcus, spent increasingly long hours in council meetings, his face growing more troubled with each passing day. The young princess noticed how the servants moved differently now, their eyes darting nervously as they went about their duties. Queen Isabella had always been different from other royal mothers. While most queens focused on teaching their daughters proper etiquette and court manners, Isabella taught Elena something far more valuable. She showed her daughter how to observe, how to listen without appearing to hear, and most importantly, how to communicate without words. The covert sign system had started as a game when Elena was just 7 years old. Isabella would touch her left earring twice to signal danger, or brush her hair behind her right ear to indicate someone was lying. Elena learned to respond with her own subtle gestures, creating an invisible language between mother and daughter that no one else could understand. Elena remembered the first time her mother explained why these signs were necessary. They were sitting in the queen's private chambers, away from the listening ears of courtiers and guards. Isabella's voice was gentle but serious as she spoke about the delicate nature of royal life. "A princess must always be prepared, my darling," her mother had said, braiding Elena's long auburn hair. "Sometimes the greatest threats come from those closest to us. Sometimes the people sworn to protect us may not always have our best interests at heart." At the time, Elena had thought her mother was being overly cautious. The royal guards had always been kind to her, bowing respectfully when she passed and ensuring her safety during outdoor activities. Captain Rodriguez, the head of the royal guard, had even taught her basic sword techniques in the training yard, much to her father's dismay. But as Elena grew older, she began to notice the subtle tensions her mother had warned her about. She observed how certain guards exchanged meaningful glances during state ceremonies, how some servants seemed to know things before they were officially announced, and how information somehow leaked from private royal meetings. The princess's education and observation extended beyond the palace walls. During public appearances, Isabella would use their secret signs to help Elena identify potential threats in crowds, distinguish between genuine supporters and those with hidden agendas, and understand the true mood of their subjects beyond the polite smiles and cheers. Elena's favorite lessons took place in the palace gardens during their evening walks. Her mother would point out details that others missed: a gardener who lingered too long near windows, a stable boy who asked too many questions about royal schedules, or visiting nobles whose stories didn't quite match their previous visits. The young princess learned to trust her instincts and her mother's teachings. When Lord Gareth visited from a neighboring kingdom and spent unusual amounts of time questioning Elena about her father's military strategies, she immediately signaled to her mother. Isabella's response was swift and subtle, redirecting the conversation while making a mental note of the man's suspicious interest. As months passed, Elena noticed her mother's signs becoming more frequent and urgent. The queen would touch her necklace 3 times during meals, indicating that Elena should be especially careful about what she said. Sometimes Isabella would adjust her rings in a specific pattern, warning her daughter that someone in the room couldn't be trusted. The most important sign was reserved for extreme danger. If Isabella ever pressed both palms flat against her dress and held them there for 3 seconds, Elena was to immediately excuse herself and go to their predetermined safe location in the old chapel. They had practiced this scenario countless times, but Elena prayed she would never need to use it. The royal guard had always seemed like an unshakable institution. These men had sworn sacred oaths to protect the royal family with their lives, and their loyalty had never been questioned. Captain Rodriguez had served under Elena's grandfather and had personally saved King Marcus from an assassination attempt years before Elena was born, but Isabella's keen eye had detected subtle changes in the guard's behavior. New recruits were asking unusual questions about palace security, patrol schedules were being altered without proper authorization, and certain guards were meeting secretly in the lower levels of the castle. The queen shared her concerns with her husband, but King Marcus trusted his guards implicitly and dismissed her worries as maternal paranoia. Elena watched her mother's growing anxiety with increasing concern. Isabella's signs were becoming more complex and frequent, and she had begun teaching Elena additional signals for situations they had never discussed before. The princess learned signs for identifying poisoned food, recognizing hostile intentions, and even communicating with loyal servants who could help them escape if necessary. During a particularly tense royal banquet, Elena observed something that made her blood run cold. She noticed Captain Rodriguez exchanging a subtle hand gesture with Lord Gareth, the same noble who had questioned her about military strategies months earlier. The gesture was brief and could have been dismissed as coincidental, but Elena's trained eye caught its deliberate nature. That night, Elena used their private sign language to tell her mother what she had witnessed. Isabella's face went pale, but she maintained her composure. She squeezed Elena's hand twice, their signal for well done, and added a third squeeze that meant, be ready for anything. The princess knew that everything they had prepared for was about to be put to the test. Her mother's teachings, which had once seemed like elaborate games, now revealed their deadly serious purpose. Elena realized that the covert signs her mother had taught her weren't just tools for palace intrigue, but potentially the key to their survival. As she lay in bed that night, Elena reviewed every sign, every signal, and every emergency procedure her mother had taught her. She understood now that Queen Isabella hadn't been preparing her daughter for hypothetical dangers, but for very real threats that were already moving against their family. The young princess closed her eyes and prepared herself for whatever tomorrow might bring, knowing that her mother's secret teachings would soon be all that stood between them and disaster. The next morning brought an unusual stillness to the palace. Elena woke to find her usual breakfast tray missing, and when she rang for her maid, no one came. The silence felt heavy and wrong, like the calm before a thunderstorm. She dressed quickly and made her way to her parents' chambers, but the corridor seemed strangely empty. Queen Isabella was already awake, standing by her window with the rigid posture Elena had learned to recognize as extreme alertness. When she saw her daughter, Isabella immediately touched her left earring twice, then held up 3 fingers behind her back. The message was clear. Danger was present, and Elena should prepare for the 3rd level of their emergency protocols. The princess moved to her mother's side, pretending to admire the view while actually scanning the courtyard below. What she saw made her stomach clench with fear. The regular palace guards were conspicuously absent from their usual posts. In their place stood unfamiliar men wearing the royal uniform but lacking the proper insignia that identified them as legitimate members of the guard. Isabella leaned close to Elena, speaking in barely audible whispers while maintaining a calm expression. She explained that during the night, several trusted servants had managed to warn her that Captain Rodriguez and a faction of guards were planning to overthrow King Marcus. The coup was scheduled to happen during the morning council meeting, when the king would be trapped in the chamber with conspirators. Elena felt her training kick in as her mother outlined their desperate situation. The loyal guards had either been arrested, killed, or sent away on false missions. The palace staff who remained were too frightened to act, and most were unaware of the true scope of the conspiracy. The queen and princess were essentially alone, surrounded by enemies who were waiting for the right moment to strike. The most chilling revelation was that Lord Gareth hadn't been gathering information for a neighboring kingdom, as they had suspected. Instead, he was coordinating with Captain Rodriguez to eliminate the entire royal family and install himself as regent until he could marry Elena and legitimize his claim to the throne. The princess shuddered at the thought of being forced into marriage with the man who was trying to destroy her family. Isabella's careful observations over the past months had revealed the full extent of the conspiracy. She had discovered that the treacherous guards had been gradually replacing loyal soldiers with mercenaries loyal only to Rodriguez and Gareth. The plot had been years in the making, with the conspirators slowly gaining control of key positions throughout the palace. Elena watched her mother's face as she explained their limited options. They could try to reach the king and warn him, but the council chamber was certainly under the control of the conspirators by now. They could attempt to escape the palace, but the exits were likely guarded by hostile forces. Their best hope was to reach the old chapel, where Isabella had hidden supplies and arranged for a trusted servant to meet them. The Queen's preparation for this moment had been meticulous. Over the past months, she had secretly moved gold, important documents, and emergency supplies to various hiding spots throughout the palace. She had also established contact with a network of loyal servants and townspeople who could help them if they managed to escape the immediate danger. Elena marveled at her mother's foresight as Isabella revealed the full scope of her preparations. The Queen had even arranged for a ship to be waiting at a nearby port, captained by a man who owed his life to the royal family. If they could reach the coast, they would have a chance to flee to a neighboring kingdom, where Isabella's sister could provide them with sanctuary. But first, they had to survive the next few hours. Isabella used their hand signals to communicate a complex plan that would require perfect timing and absolute trust in each other. Elena would need to play the role of an innocent child who suspected nothing, while actually serving as her mother's eyes and ears in areas where the Queen couldn't go. The first test came when a knock sounded at the chamber door. Isabella quickly signaled for Elena to sit at the dressing table and pretend to be having her hair braided. The Queen opened the door to find two guards she didn't recognize, both wearing expressions that failed to hide their hostile intentions. The men claimed they had been sent to escort the Queen and Princess to the Great Hall for an important announcement. Isabella responded with perfect royal composure, agreeing graciously while using subtle hand movements to signal Elena about the guards' weapons, positioning, and apparent level of alertness. Elena played her part flawlessly, chattering about wanting to wear her favorite dress for the important occasion and asking if they would see her father soon. The guards relaxed slightly, apparently convinced that the royal women suspected nothing. They didn't notice the princess carefully observing their faces, memorizing their features and noting which direction their eyes darted when they thought no one was looking. As they walked through the palace corridors, Elena and Isabella continued their silent communication. The Queen identified safe servants with tiny gestures, marked dangerous areas with subtle touches to her jewelry, and indicated potential escape routes with barely perceptible nods toward specific doorways. The princess was amazed by how much information her mother conveyed without speaking a word. Isabella pointed out that the guards were nervous, suggesting this was their first major conspiracy. She noted that their weapons were too clean, indicating they hadn't been in recent combat, which meant some loyal guards might still be alive. Most importantly, she observed that the guards kept checking the time, revealing that the coup was following a strict schedule. When they reached the Great Hall, Elena's worst fears were confirmed. King Marcus was nowhere to be seen, and the throne sat empty while Lord Gareth paced nearby with barely contained excitement. The princess counted at least 20 armed men positioned throughout the room, all wearing the royal uniform but none showing proper respect for the Queen's presence. Isabella maintained her regal bearing as Lord Gareth approached with false courtesy. He spoke smooth words about ensuring their safety during a period of political transition, but Elena could see the malice in his eyes. The princess used her mother's training to read his body language, noting his clenched fists, the way he avoided direct eye contact with Isabella, and how he kept glancing toward the doors as if expecting someone. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a sword. Elena realized that everyone was waiting for something, some signal or arrival that would trigger the next phase of their plan. She caught her mother's eye and saw Isabella's almost imperceptible nod toward the large tapestry near the eastern wall, their predetermined signal for the chapel escape route. But before they could act, Captain Rodriguez entered the hall with a group of his most trusted conspirators. The man who had once taught Elena sword techniques now looked at her with cold calculation, as if she were merely a political piece to be moved around a board. His presence changed the atmosphere in the room, and Elena knew their window for escape was rapidly closing. Isabella squeezed her daughter's hand in their private signal for maximum danger, and Elena felt her heart race as she realized that everything her mother had taught her was about to be put to the ultimate test. The covert signs that had once seemed like a game between mother and daughter were now literally a matter of life and death. Captain Rodriguez's entrance brought an immediate change in the room's energy. Elena watched as the mercenaries straightened their postures and moved into more strategic positions, clearly following a prearranged plan. The captain's weathered face showed no trace of the kindness he had once displayed toward the royal family, and Elena felt a chill as she realized how completely he had deceived them all. Lord Gareth stepped forward with obvious relief at Rodriguez's arrival, but Elena noticed her mother's subtle observation signals indicating that there was tension between the two conspirators. Isabella's trained eye caught the slight delay in Rodriguez's acknowledgement of Gareth's greeting, and the way the captain's men positioned themselves as much to watch Gareth as to guard the royal women. The princess used her mother's teachings to analyze the complex dynamics playing out before them. While both men were clearly working against the royal family, their alliance seemed fragile. Rodriguez commanded the loyalty of the armed men, but Gareth held the political connections and legal justifications needed to legitimize their coup. Neither fully trusted the other, and Elena realized this tension might create an opportunity for escape. Isabella maintained her royal composure, while subtly signaling Elena to pay attention to the servants still present in the hall. Most were clearly terrified, but the queen's sharp eyes identified 3 individuals who seemed more alert than afraid. These servants responded to Isabella's nearly invisible hand signals, confirming they remained loyal to the royal family despite the dangerous circumstances. The queen's years of careful observation had taught her to distinguish between genuine fear and performance, and she could see that several servants were deliberately positioning themselves near exits and potential weapons. Elena marveled at her mother's ability to coordinate resistance activities through nothing more than subtle gestures and meaningful glances. "Captain," Rodriguez began speaking about the need for political stability and change, his words carefully chosen to sound reasonable to any outside observers, but Elena could hear the underlying threats in his tone, and she noticed how his hand never moved far from his sword hilt. The captain's speech was clearly rehearsed, designed to justify their actions if word ever reached other kingdoms. Lord Gareth interrupted Rodriguez's speech with barely concealed impatience, demanding to know the status of King Marcus. The tension between the conspirators became more obvious as Rodriguez's jaw tightened at being questioned in front of his men. Elena caught her mother's eye and saw Isabella's quick signal indicating that this friction between their enemies was something they needed to remember and potentially exploit. The captain's response was deliberately vague, mentioning that the king was being kept safe in secure quarters until the political situation stabilized. Elena's blood ran cold as she realized her father was likely imprisoned somewhere in the palace, possibly injured or worse. Isabella's face remained impassive, but her daughter could see the pain flash briefly in her eyes before she regained control. Elena noticed that some of the guards seemed uncomfortable with the situation, occasionally glancing at each other with uncertain expressions. Her mother had taught her to identify these signs of moral conflict, explaining that not all enemies were equally committed to their cause. Some of these men might be following orders out of fear rather than conviction, and understanding their motivations could be crucial for survival. The princess observed that Rodriguez's most loyal supporters stood closest to him, while the uncertain guards were positioned farther away. Isabella's subtle signals confirmed that she had noticed this arrangement as well, and she began using their hand language to identify which guards might be potential allies if the right pressure was applied. As the minutes passed, Elena became increasingly aware that they were waiting for something specific. Both Rodriguez and Gareth kept checking the position of the sun through the tall windows, and several guards had been sent out and returned with whispered reports. The timing of whatever was planned next seemed critical to their success. The breakthrough came when a young servant girl approached with refreshments, moving with the practiced invisibility that palace staff had perfected over years of service. But Elena's trained observation caught the girl's subtle signal to Isabella, a tiny adjustment of how she placed the tray that conveyed urgent information. The servant's message was clear. Loyal forces were gathering outside the palace, and the conspirators' control wasn't as complete as they believed. Isabella's response was equally subtle, a slight shift in her posture that thanked the servant and acknowledged the information. Elena watched this exchange with admiration for her mother's ability to maintain communication networks even in the most dangerous circumstances. The queen had clearly spent years building relationships with palace staff who would remain loyal in exactly this kind of crisis. The news of outside resistance changed the dynamic in the room. Rodriguez's confidence seemed slightly shaken as he realized that word of their coup had somehow spread beyond the palace walls. Elena could see him recalculating his plans, wondering how information had leaked when he thought they controlled all communication channels. Lord Gareth began pressing for immediate action, arguing that they needed to complete their takeover before any external forces could intervene. His urgency revealed another weakness in their alliance, as Rodriguez clearly preferred a more measured approach, while Gareth wanted to rush toward their final objectives. Elena memorized these strategic disagreements, understanding they might prove crucial later. The princess used her mother's training to study the positioning of everyone in the room, creating a mental map of potential escape routes, available weapons, and likely allies. Isabella had taught her that information gathering never stopped, even in the most dangerous situations, because circumstances could change rapidly and opportunities for action might appear without warning. Elena noticed that the loyal servants had gradually moved into positions where they could potentially create distractions or block key doorways if needed. Her mother's silent coordination of these movements was masterful, accomplished entirely through subtle gestures that the conspirators didn't recognize as communication. The Queen had effectively organized a resistance network right under their enemies' noses. The tension reached a critical point when a guard rushed in with news that required Rodriguez's immediate attention. Elena couldn't hear the whispered report, but she could see the captain's face darken with anger and concern. Whatever was happening outside the palace wasn't going according to their plan, and the conspirators' confidence was beginning to crack. Isabella seized this moment of distraction to give Elena the most important signal of their entire system. A gentle touch to her daughter's shoulder, followed by 3 quick taps with her index finger. This was the code they had practiced but hoped never to use. The signal that meant they were about to attempt their most dangerous escape plan. Elena's heart raced as she realized the time for observation and patience was over. Her mother's covert signs had revealed the perfect moment for action, and now everything depended on whether a 12-year-old princess could execute the escape techniques her mother had taught her during those secret evening lessons in the royal library. The young princess took a deep breath and prepared herself for what was about to unfold, knowing that her mother's training and their secret communication system were about to face their ultimate test. Everything they had learned, every sign they had practiced, every moment of preparation was leading to this critical moment when they would either escape or face the consequences of their enemy's complete victory. Elena felt her mother's signal like an electric shock through her body, but years of training kept her expression neutral. Isabella had taught her that the most crucial moments required the most perfect acting, and now the princess channeled every lesson about appearing innocent while preparing for decisive action. The young girl began fidgeting with her dress, a movement that looked like childish nervousness but was actually her way of checking that the small knife her mother had given her was still concealed in the hidden pocket. The loyal servant girl who had delivered the refreshment tray earlier was still in the room, moving with practiced efficiency as she collected empty goblets. Elena watched as the girl positioned herself near the massive oak doors, ready to assist their escape attempt. Isabella's network of loyal supporters was more extensive than Elena had realized, and she felt a surge of hope knowing they weren't facing this danger entirely alone. Captain Rodriguez finished receiving his urgent report and turned back toward the royal women, with a darker expression than before. Elena could see that whatever news he had received was forcing him to accelerate his timeline, which might work in their favor if it made him careless. The princess observed how the captain's stress was affecting his men, noting that several guards seemed increasingly nervous about their involvement in the conspiracy. Isabella maintained her regal posture, while using micro-expressions to coordinate with Elena. The Queen's slight tilt of her head toward the eastern tapestry reminded her, daughter, of their planned escape route, while a barely perceptible adjustment of her necklace indicated that Elena should be ready to create a distraction when the moment was right. The princess marveled at how much communication could happen in plain sight of their enemies. Lord Gareth approached the throne with obvious impatience, demanding that Rodriguez explain the delay in their plans. Elena could see that Gareth's political ambitions were making him reckless, and his public questioning of the captain was creating visible tension among the armed men. The princess recognized this as exactly the kind of discord between enemies that her mother had taught her to watch for and potentially exploit. The breakthrough moment came when Gareth made a crucial mistake. In his frustration, He began speaking too freely about their plans, mentioning details about King Marcus's imprisonment and their intentions for the royal family. Elena saw several of the guards react with surprise and discomfort, realizing they hadn't been told the full scope of the conspiracy. These men had signed up to support a political change, not to participate in what was clearly becoming a violent overthrow. Isabella caught Elena's eye and gave the signal they had practiced countless times. A single finger pressed briefly against her temple, indicating that this moment of enemy confusion was their opportunity. Elena understood immediately and began implementing the first phase of their escape plan, which required her to play the role of a frightened child, while actually positioning herself for quick movement. The princess allowed her voice to tremble as she asked Lord Gareth about her father's safety, using genuine concern to fuel a performance that would lower everyone's guard. Her apparent vulnerability made several guards visibly uncomfortable, and Elena could see that some of them were questioning their involvement in a plot that threatened a child. Her mother's lessons about reading human nature were proving invaluable in identifying potential allies among their captors. Elena's display of childish fear had the desired effect on Captain Rodriguez, who stepped forward with false reassurance about the king's safety. His attempt to comfort her required him to move closer, which was exactly what Isabella's plan needed. The captain's positioning now put him between the conspirators and several of his own guards, creating the tactical advantage the queen had been waiting for. Isabella used this moment to give Elena the most complex signal of their entire system, a series of tiny gestures that communicated a multi-step plan requiring precise timing. Elena would need to stumble and create a distraction at exactly the right moment, while the queen used the confusion to reach a concealed weapon she had hidden behind the eastern tapestry weeks ago in preparation for exactly this scenario. The princess began her performance by allowing herself to appear overwhelmed by the tension in the room. She swayed slightly as if about to faint, drawing concerned attention from guards who retained some basic human decency despite their participation in the coup. Elena's apparent distress caused several men to move toward her, unknowingly improving the positioning for their escape attempt. Elena executed her stumble perfectly, falling toward Captain Rodriguez in a way that seemed like genuine weakness but actually forced him to catch her, leaving his sword arm temporarily unusable. The confusion created by this apparent accident allowed Isabella to move toward the tapestry with practiced stealth, her years of secret preparation finally coming to fruition. But as Elena recovered from her staged collapse, she saw something that made her blood freeze. Lord Gareth was watching them with cold calculation, his eyes showing that he had recognized their performance for what it was. The princess realized with growing horror that their enemy was more observant than they had believed, and their carefully planned escape attempt might have been detected before it could succeed. Gareth's voice cut through the commotion with deadly quiet authority as he ordered his men to seize both the queen and princess immediately. Elena saw her mother's hand freeze just inches from the concealed weapon, and she understood that their primary escape plan had just crumbled. Isabella's eyes met her daughter's across the room, and Elena saw a flash of desperate thinking as the queen rapidly calculated alternative options. The loyal servant girl near the doors chose that moment to drop her heavy tray of goblets, creating a crash that echoed throughout the hall and startled everyone present. Elena realized this wasn't an accident but a deliberate attempt to help them escape, even though it meant the servant girl was revealing her loyalty and putting herself in mortal danger. The young princess felt a surge of courage seeing ordinary people willing to risk everything for her family. In the seconds of confusion caused by the servant's sacrifice, Isabella abandoned her attempt to reach the hidden weapon and instead gave Elena the emergency signal they had hoped never to use. The queen's desperate hand gesture indicated that they needed to implement their most dangerous backup plan, one that required Elena to trust completely in her mother's training and her own courage. Elena understood immediately what her mother was asking of her. The princess would need to use every skill Isabella had taught her about moving unseen, reading people's intentions, and surviving in hostile territory. Most terrifyingly, she would need to leave her mother behind and attempt to reach help on her own, trusting that Isabella could survive long enough for rescue to arrive. The young princess felt tears threaten to overwhelm her as she realized she might be seeing her mother for the last time. But Isabella's steady gaze reminded Elena of all the evenings they had spent preparing for exactly this moment. All the lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the responsibilities that came with royal blood. The Queen's expression conveyed absolute confidence in her daughter's abilities and absolute love regardless of what happened next. Elena took a shaky breath and prepared herself for the most terrifying challenge of her young life. Her mother's covert signals had brought them to this desperate moment, and now everything depended on whether a 12-year-old girl could execute an escape plan that would have challenged an experienced adult. The princess steeled herself for what was about to unfold, knowing that her mother's teachings were about to face their ultimate test in a situation where failure meant death for everyone she loved. Elena's mind raced as she processed her mother's emergency signal, but years of training had prepared her for exactly this moment of supreme crisis. The princess forced herself to maintain the appearance of a terrified child, while internally shifting into the survival mode Isabella had drilled into her during countless secret practice sessions. Every lesson about observation, stealth, and quick thinking was about to be put to the most crucial test imaginable. The chaos caused by the servant girl's dropped tray provided precious seconds of distraction, but Elena knew the opportunity wouldn't last long. She caught one final look from her mother, seeing in Isabella's eyes both absolute love and complete faith in her daughter's abilities. The Queen's expression conveyed a message that needed no covert signals. Elena was ready for this challenge, even if she didn't feel ready herself. Using skills her mother had taught her about moving invisibly in plain sight, Elena began edging toward the servants' entrance near the back of the Great Hall. She had learned to walk with the same unnoticed efficiency as palace staff, keeping her head down and moving with purpose but not urgency. The princess felt her heart pounding but forced her breathing to remain steady, just as Isabella had taught her during their practice sessions. Elena's progress was helped by the continued argument between Lord Gareth and Captain Rodriguez, whose disagreement over how to handle the situation was creating exactly the kind of distraction her mother had taught her to exploit. The princess observed that several guards were more focused on their commander's conflict than on watching prisoners, and she used their inattention to move closer to potential freedom. The loyal servant girl who had created the distraction was now being roughly questioned by two of Rodriguez's men, but Elena could see that the young woman was deliberately drawing attention to herself and away from the royal family's movements. The princess felt a wave of gratitude and determination, knowing that this brave servant was sacrificing herself to give Elena a chance at escape. Such loyalty couldn't be wasted. As Elena reached the servants' entrance, she utilized another of her mother's crucial lessons about reading architectural details for escape purposes. Isabella had taught her that servants' passages often connected to hidden routes throughout the palace, and Elena had memorized these pathways during their secret exploration sessions. The princess knew exactly which corridor would take her toward the old chapel where help might be waiting. The moment Elena slipped into the servants' passage, she felt the full weight of being alone for the first time in this crisis, but her mother's training kicked in immediately, and she began moving through the narrow corridors with the stealth techniques Isabella had made her practice until they became second nature. Every step was deliberate, every sound carefully controlled, every corner approached with maximum caution. Elena's progress through the servants' passages revealed the full extent of the conspiracy's reach. She encountered several unfamiliar guards posted at positions that should have been empty, confirming her mother's worst fears about how deeply the plot had penetrated palace security. The princess used her observation skills to note their positions and behavioral patterns, information that might prove crucial if loyal forces needed to retake the palace. The young princess felt her confidence growing as she successfully avoided detection by hostile guards, her mother's training proving its worth with each successful maneuver. Elena realized that Isabella's seemingly overprotective lessons had actually given her capabilities that few adults possessed, and she began to understand the full scope of her mother's wisdom in preparing her for dangers that seemed impossible until they became reality. Elena's route toward the old chapel required her to pass through several areas where Rodriguez's men had established checkpoints, but the princess employed every stealth technique her mother had taught her. She moved during shift changes when guards were distracted, used shadows and architectural features for concealment, and most importantly, maintained the mental discipline to stay focused despite the terror and urgency of her situation. The princess encountered her first major obstacle when she discovered that the direct route to the chapel was blocked by a group of mercenaries who were clearly expecting someone to attempt exactly the escape she was trying. Elena felt a moment of despair before remembering her mother's lessons about adapting plans when circumstances changed. Isabella had taught her that rigid thinking was the enemy of survival, and flexibility was often more important than courage. Elena retreated to a hiding spot and used her observational skills to study the guards' behavior patterns, looking for weaknesses in their coverage that might allow her to pass. Her mother's training in reading human nature paid off when she noticed that one guard was consistently looking away from his assigned area to watch a card game his companions were playing during their supposed vigil. Using timing skills that Isabella had drilled into her during their practice sessions, Elena waited for the perfect moment when the distracted guard's attention was fully focused on the card game. The princess slipped past his position with movements so carefully controlled that even trained observers might have missed her passage. Her heart hammered with the knowledge that discovery would mean not just her own death, but the failure of any chance to save her parents. Elena's successful passage brought her to a crossroads where she had to choose between continuing toward the chapel or attempting to reach the outside world directly through a route that would bypass the predetermined meeting point. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that sometimes the safest plan wasn't the original plan, and that survival required constant evaluation of changing circumstances. The princess chose to continue toward the chapel, trusting in her mother's preparation and the possibility that help would be waiting as arranged. But as she approached the final corridor, Elena heard voices that made her freeze in terror. She recognized Captain Rodriguez's distinctive tone, and he was clearly giving orders about searching for escaped prisoners. The princess realized that their enemies had discovered her absence and were actively hunting for her. Elena pressed herself against the stone wall and used every lesson her mother had taught her about remaining invisible while gathering information. She listened carefully to Rodriguez's instructions, learning that they believed she was trying to reach the main gates, which meant her actual route toward the chapel might still be undetected. The captain's focus on the wrong escape path was exactly the kind of enemy mistake Isabella had taught her to recognize and exploit, but Elena's relief was short-lived when she heard Rodriguez mention that Queen Isabella was being held in the throne room under increased guard, and that any rescue attempts would result in immediate execution. The princess felt tears of fear and rage, but she forced herself to remember her mother's lessons about maintaining emotional control during crisis situations. Isabella had taught her that strong feelings could be useful fuel for action, but only if they didn't cloud judgment or interfere with careful planning. Elena knew that reaching the chapel successfully was now more crucial than ever, because it might be the only way to save her mother's life. The princess steeled herself for the final approach to their predetermined meeting point, knowing that everything her mother had taught her during those covert training sessions was about to determine whether their family would survive this conspiracy or be destroyed by the enemies who had infiltrated their most trusted protections. As Elena prepared for the last phase of her desperate escape attempt, she carried with her not just the practical skills her mother had taught her, but also the unshakable knowledge that Isabella's love and training had prepared her for this exact moment of crisis. The young princess moved forward with growing determination, ready to prove that her mother's covert signals and secret lessons had created a survivor capable of facing any challenge. Elena approached the old chapel with every sense heightened to maximum alertness, her mother's training having taught her that the most dangerous moments often came just before safety was reached. The ancient stone building had served as a place of worship for generations of her family, but now it represented her only hope of finding the help Isabella had promised would be waiting. The princess moved through the shadows like a ghost, using architectural features for concealment, just as her mother had taught her during their secret practice sessions. The chapel's heavy wooden doors stood slightly ajar, which Elena recognized as the predetermined signal that friendly forces were indeed present. But her mother's lessons about maintaining caution even in seemingly safe situations made her pause to observe before entering. The princess spent precious minutes studying the area for signs of ambush, checking sight lines and listening for any sounds that might indicate the chapel had been compromised by Rodriguez's men. Elena's careful observation revealed movement inside the chapel that matched the patterns Isabella had described for identifying loyal supporters. The princess saw shadows moving in ways that suggested people were deliberately avoiding the windows, and she caught glimpses of clothing that belonged to palace staff rather than military uniforms. Most importantly, she heard a soft whistle that matched the musical phrase her mother had taught her as a recognition signal for this exact scenario. The princess approached the chapel entrance using the specific sequence of movements Isabella had drilled into her for making contact with potential allies. Elena knocked 3 times, paused, knocked twice more, then waited for the responding pattern that would confirm these were indeed the loyal supporters her mother had arranged to meet them. When the correct response came from within, Elena felt her first moment of genuine hope since the crisis had begun. The chapel door opened to reveal Thomas, the elderly groundskeeper, who had served the royal family for over 30 years. Elena had always known him as a kind man who maintained the palace gardens. But now she discovered that he was also one of her mother's most trusted agents in the network of loyal supporters. His weathered face showed immense relief at seeing the princess alive, and Elena realized that news of the coup had already reached the outside world. Thomas quickly ushered Elena into the chapel, where she discovered that her mother's preparations had been even more extensive than she had imagined. The sacred space had been transformed into a command center where loyal palace staff, trusted townspeople, and even some soldiers who had remained faithful to the royal family were coordinating rescue efforts. Elena felt overwhelmed by the realization that while she had felt utterly alone during her escape, she was actually part of a much larger resistance movement. The princess learned that Captain Rodriguez's coup attempt had indeed failed to achieve complete control, just as the servant girl's earlier signal had suggested. Many guards had refused to participate when they learned the true scope of the conspiracy, and word of the plot had spread to neighboring kingdoms faster than the conspirators had anticipated. Elena's successful escape had provided crucial confirmation that the royal family was still alive and fighting back. Elena discovered that her father, King Marcus, had not been captured as Rodriguez claimed, but had instead been warned by loyal guards and was currently leading a counterattack from a secure location outside the palace. The news filled Elena with joy and determination, and she realized that her mother's sacrifice in staying behind had allowed Isabella to continue coordinating resistance efforts from within the palace, walls through signals and messages that only she knew how to send. Thomas explained that Elena's escape had triggered the next phase of their rescue plan, which involved coordinated attacks on key positions held by the conspirators. The princess's intelligence about guard positions, Lord Gareth's behavior, and the tensions between the enemy leaders provided crucial information that would help loyal forces retake the palace with minimal bloodshed. Elena marveled at how her mother's training in observation had prepared her to gather exactly the intelligence needed for a successful rescue operation. The young princess watched in amazement as Thomas and the other loyal supporters implemented a communication system that rivaled her mother's covert signals in its sophistication. Messages were being passed through a network of trusted individuals who could move freely throughout the kingdom, and Elena realized that Isabella had spent years building relationships that would prove crucial in exactly this kind of crisis situation. Elena learned that the rescue operation would require her to play one final crucial role, using the covert signals her mother had taught her to coordinate with Isabella from a distance. The plan involved Elena positioning herself where she could see into the Great Hall and use their secret sign language to provide her mother with information about the rescue force's timing and positioning. The princess felt both terror and pride at being trusted with such a critical mission. As Elena prepared for her role in the rescue operation, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. Her mother's seemingly overprotective lessons had actually been preparing her for the greatest challenge of her young life, and every covert signal, every observation technique, and every stealth skill had proven essential for survival. The princess understood now that Isabella's love had been expressed not just through affection, but through the practical preparation that had saved Elena's life. The rescue began at sunset, with coordinated attacks on multiple positions throughout the palace that forced Rodriguez's men to spread their forces thin. Elena took her assigned position in the bell tower, where she could see into the Great Hall and communicate with her mother through the window. The princess felt her heart race as she saw Isabella still standing with regal composure, despite hours of captivity, and Elena knew that the queen was watching for her daughter's signals. Elena used their most complex communication sequence to inform her mother about the rescue force's positions and timing, seeing Isabella's almost imperceptible nods of acknowledgement. The Queen immediately began implementing her own part of the plan, using subtle movements to position herself and the remaining loyal servants for the moment when the rescue force would breach the Great Hall. The princess marveled at her mother's ability to coordinate resistance activities even while surrounded by enemies. The critical moment arrived when King Marcus himself led the loyal guards into the Great Hall, catching the conspirators completely off guard. Elena watched through the window as Rodriguez and Gareth realized their plot had failed, and she saw several of their supporters immediately surrender rather than fight against their rightful king. The princess felt overwhelming joy as she witnessed her parents' reunion and the collapse of the conspiracy that had threatened to destroy their family. In the aftermath of the failed coup, Elena learned the full scope of what her mother's training had accomplished. The covert signals that had seemed like elaborate games between mother and daughter had actually created a communication system sophisticated enough to coordinate a successful resistance movement. Isabella's careful observation and preparation had anticipated nearly every aspect of the crisis, and her decision to train Elena in these skills had literally saved the royal family from destruction. Elena discovered that several neighboring kingdoms had been prepared to intervene if the coup had succeeded. But the rapid collapse of Rodriguez's conspiracy had prevented a larger war that could have devastated the region. The princess realized that her mother's network of loyal supporters and her own successful escape had been crucial factors in maintaining peace and stability beyond their own kingdoms' borders. As the royal family was reunited in safety, Elena felt profound gratitude for her mother's wisdom in preparing her for dangers that had seemed impossible until they became reality. The covert signals that Isabella had taught her daughter had proven to be far more than a means of private communication between mother and child. They had been the foundation of a survival system that had preserved not just their lives, but the stability of their entire kingdom. Elena understood now that Queen Isabella's greatest gift to her daughter had not been royal privileges or political position, but the practical skills and mental preparation needed to face any challenge with courage and intelligence. The young princess looked forward to the day when she might pass these same crucial lessons on to her own children, ensuring that the wisdom her mother had shared would continue to protect future generations of their family. The covert signs that had saved them would become a lasting legacy of a mother's love, expressed through the most practical and life-saving education any parent could provide.